Good morning, everyone. You've made it to the last day. So hopefully the talks have been of benefit to you and not scared you away with too many technical terms and so forth. Let me just share my screen now. Okay. So can you all see the PowerPoint screen? Just nod your head. Okay. Okay, so we're on the last stretch today, and we've covered quite a lot about the technical terms that you'll see concerning karma and a lot of its characteristics and so forth. And we quickly went through the importance of understanding karma in conjunction with the three life cycle. So where what we have to look at now is the other important aspect when talking about karma is defilement. And Venerable Tangzi has already touched on that in his talk. And in today's talk, we'll be going into a bit of detail. So I might be going a bit fast because I'm trying to cover as much of the material as I can. So as he mentioned, as Venerable Tangzi mentioned today, when we talk about karma, cause and effect, if you want a bit of a reference, we're actually, talking about the second truth, the truth on the causation of suffering among the Four Noble Truths. So one crucial question to kind of ask is, why do we continually experience suffering? Why does it seem to be never ending? So the answer to that question is because we continue to create the causes and provide the conditions. And that's why there's just this continual cycle of suffering. But understanding that, we also need to then ask the question, what actually triggers those karmic forces to become active, to sprout, germinate, and bear fruit? And the answer to that is defilements. Hang on. Okay. So defilements are important in the workings of karma because just having karmic forces alone is not enough for it to bear fruit. So if you think back to the simile of a seed, if you just, you might go online and order a packet of flower seeds. Just purely having that packet of seeds, it's not just going to germinate. You can't just hold it and say, okay, seed, start germinating. It needs conditions. It needs the right soil temperature. It needs the right nutrients in the soil. It needs water. It needs sunlight and so forth before it can actually start to say, yes, the conditions are right now. I'm going to start germinating. So for karmic forces, it's the same thing. Karmic forces do not bear fruit at random. If it did, this world would be absolutely chaotic. But karmic forces rely on defilements. And defilement, we need to understand, has two roles in the workings of karma. The first role is that it is the catalyst for creating karmic forces. So when we carry out an action, when we perform some form of karma, that can only leave behind a karmic force that will bring forth future results if that action arose in the accompaniment of defilement. So a good way to understand this is to compare the actions of a sage, the actions of the Buddha, compared to the actions of ordinary beings. So because the sages have already cut off their defilements, their three karmas are pure. Their three karmas in Venerable Tang's talk, he highlighted their actions, their speech, their thoughts, their mental activities all accord with transcendental wisdom. So it doesn't create karmic forces. On the contrary, ordinary beings like you and I, we still have our attachments, we still have our ignorance and so forth. And with that, our actions are accompanied with defilements. So we create karmic forces which provide the potential for future results. Now, karmic forces, as I said, also relies on defilements. So the creation of the karmic force relies on defilement, and once that force has been created, remember it is latent and it can only start to germinate and produce a result with the condition of defilement. So it needs defilement to ripen. That's why if we can cut off our defilements, we will stop creating new karmic forces, and the existing ones do not have the conditions they need to ripen. So that means we should actually pay a bit more attention to understanding what is defilement. Now when we use the word defilement, it tends to have a very negative connotation. It's always something bad. But as we look deeper and deeper into the really refined aspects of defilement, it doesn't have to be extremely bad, but it just needs to be, the defilement is sufficient to keep us in this cycle of producing karma, producing karmic forces and experiencing its results. So defilements are what we call unwholesome elements in the mind. Now, these unwholesome elements can relate to our mental activities. It can relate to the aspects of knowledge, what we know, how we perceive things and so forth. It can relate to our emotions, you know, the feelings that we go through. And then it can relate to our intentions when we do things and so forth. So all the mental activities, defilements can relate to any aspects of our mental activities. And defilement affects our three karmas and causes us to basically lose self-control. Now, when we say lose self-control, it's not like, you know, someone that's completely drunk and out of self-control, or some sort of a drug addict that is completely out of control, not knowing what to do. This loss of self-control can be a bit more subtle in that, you know, the defilements of anger, frustration, and hatred can make you probably a bit stubborn, or just make you not want to help a certain person because you just don't like them. So that's kind of what we mean by self-control, in that, you know, we should be providing help to beings equally, but because that emotion of anger towards a certain being, towards a certain person arises when you see them, it actually makes you unable to perform that act and so forth. So self-control can be, should be understood in a much more broader sense. Now, karma, remember the definition of karma as in our three karmas. When it's created with defilement, it will plant the seeds for future suffering. So we need to also understand that defilements, like karma, is very complex and it varies in degrees as well. So when we talk about defilements, sometimes you'll come across the word, the three unwholesome roots, and in Chinese it's san, bu san, gen. And this is referring to, also known as the three poisons, greed, hatred, and ignorance. And these are what are classified as the fundamental types of defilement. Because I said the range and degrees of defilements are so many, and if you go into the Abhidharma studies, there are so many different terms for one type of defilement. And the different terms basically reflect the slight changes in certain degrees of certain emotions and reactions and all that. But these three unwholesome roots, as the meaning of root is, they are the basic categories in which all defilements can be assigned to. So if we look at the defilement of greed, this will cover aspects such as desires and cravings, our attachment and clinging. So the defilement of being stingy and not willing to share will fall into greed. The defilement of arrogance also falls into greed. Sometimes arrogance falls into ignorance, but here arrogance is more like because you have that attachment to the self, you then develop this pride that you are better, you are more worthy, and so forth. So that's why it's more aligned to the aspect of greed, which in this case would reflect a very strong love or attachment to oneself. And then if we look at hatred, you know, the aspects of hatred would include anger, frustration, jealousy, envy, spite. So, and note there's the etc. behind all of them, because the range of possible definitions of different defilements are quite expansive. And then with ignorance, in the Buddhist sense, when we're talking about this, it refers to having wrong views. It refers to having doubt. It also includes the defilement of being sleepy, forgetful, and confused. And it includes the mental activity of not believing in the Dharma and so forth as well. So these are just examples, just to show you how these three unwholesome roots are the fundamental types of defilement to which all other defilements can be assigned. So as I said, these three unwholesome roots are also known as the three poisons. And so what we want to do now is to look at these three poisons in a little bit more detail. So ignorance is one of the fundamental defilements that the Buddhist teachings keep pointing out to us. And this ignorance is not being stupid, it's not being unknowledgeable. So you can still have a PhD degree and still be ignorant in the Buddhist terms. Indeed, most of us are. And this ignorance is actually relating to our lack of understanding about the truth. So our lack of full comprehension of emptiness, of dependent co-arising. So this is like a person who is drunk and tipsy. They still have knowledge and perception. They can still see things and they still have the functioning of their knowledge. But because they are drunk, they are affected by the alcohol. What they perceive, what they understand, the way that it is understood in their minds turns out to be erroneous. And this lack of understanding about the truth in particular is it focuses on not knowing about cause and effect, not knowing that there is a difference between good and bad, wholesome and unwholesome, not knowing about karma and its results, not knowing that there are sages that are enlightened and there are ordinary beings that are unenlightened, and not knowing the Dharma. And this includes both the principles, the theories, and the practices of the Dharma. So with this ignorance, because of our lack of understanding concerning the truth and not knowing the Dharma, cause and effect, and so forth, what happens is we will then look at something that is impermanent, in truth is impermanent, but we view it as permanent. And so this in particular is referring to the identity of the self, or some people's attachment to the soul as the impermanent part of us. Or when we look at all things, the teachings of the Buddha tell us that all things are impermanent, but some people will look at it and say, it's not changing. How can you say that that is impermanent? So with our lack of understanding, with this defilement of ignorance, we take what is impermanent to be permanent. And similarly, we take what is actually suffering to be joy. And we will regard what is impure to be pure. And we will also fixate on an identity of a self, an intrinsic self, when there really isn't one. So when we talk about the poison or the root defilement of hatred, this is an emotion or an attitude of ill will towards things that we encounter and dislike. And this hatred, this defilement can be directed towards others, but it can also be directed towards ourselves as well. So when it's directed to others, so it's directed externally, it can develop into conflicts, it can develop into acts of harming, it can develop into less severe things as just annoying people and so forth. Now, if it's directed internally to ourselves, it will bubble inside of ourselves as hate, animosity, and envy. And when that bubbling inside of us gets too strong, it could then actually project out externally through our bodily actions and speech as well. Now, hatred is extremely grave of a defilement because it can stop us from doing good things. And it is the source of all harmful deeds. So the teachings in the sutras will mention that a single thought of hatred opens the gates to 80,000 obstacles. Now here, even though there's a very precise number of 80,000, don't actually ask, okay, can you list all 80,000? When you see these really large numbers in the Buddhist texts, you really should understand that it's a figurative expression to show that it's countless, it's innumerable. Okay, I need to stress that because I remember once presenting a bit of a short Dharma talk to someone and just discussing it with the neighbours around here. And one old man actually did start asking, so what are the 80,000? Can you list all of them for me? So if someone asks you to list all 80,000 or 84,000 and so forth, you need to help them understand this is a figurative way of expressing countless, innumerable. And in the sutras, you'll also hear that hatred, this defilement of hatred, is like a wildfire because it can reduce everything to ashes, and in particular it can burn up all your wholesomeness, all your virtues, and turn that into ash. The third is greed. Now, greed is sometimes expressed as desire. Sometimes it's the word craving is used. So what this defilement is referring to is a clinging, an attachment to anything that is connected to ourselves. So it can manifest in terms of us holding on to the past, always thinking back to, oh, wasn't that great? If only we could have that again, and so forth. It could also be manifested in terms of indulging in what we have at the present, or as well as longing for the future. So that is also a craving. And this longing for the future includes this longing to live, to always just live perpetually. So even though we know death is inevitable, we still have that innate longing. There must be a next life. There must be some uh, next destination. I can't just die and that would be it. So that's the longing for the future and future lives as well. So although greed, desire, craving is not as grave as hatred, it's still quite a significant and dire defilement within all of us, because it's like water that can actually seep into everything. It just kind of makes its way, and it just slowly causes things to fester and mold and go really yucky. So greed can manifest as love for oneself, and that includes the hope for a future life or even some eternal life. And greed can also manifest in terms of love for others and our possessions. So in the form of love, you might think, shouldn't we share a bit of love and all that? So the worldly definition of love is good if it pushes us to perform good deeds and all that. But that worldly form of love is ultimately grounded in an attachment to ourselves. This type of love, this type of greed is not pure, because deep down inside there is still that attachment to oneself. And so the kindness that we project from our love can actually turn into hatred when things start to go against our will. And the example I use most often is of marriage and divorce. So, you can love someone so much that you would want to marry them, but if the marriage, goes belly up and pear-shaped, you then view that person, your ex-partner now, as the worst person in the world, and you just have, people tend to have this disgust or aversion to that person. So that's why this type of greed, this type of love is actually not entirely wholesome. So love can also this greed and love can also turn out to become hoarding, just holding things for yourself. And we see that in Australia during the early days of the coronavirus, where people were just hoarding toilet paper. I don't know if you got news of that, but it was crazy. People were stockpiling toilet paper to the point they were fighting over it in the shopping centres as well. And, that boils down to looking after oneself. And this love, this greed can turn out to be overly possessive of things, which is hoarding. But in this sense, this possessive nature can actually be projected to people, where you try to then possess your partner, your children, and and then it turns out to be very controlling as well. So that then brings on harm. And even if we don't have all those negativities with love and greed and this type of desire, just by having love for something and knowing impermanence, when impermanence starts to reveal itself and we lose that item, we will experience sorrow and pain. So the loss of what we cherish brings on sorrow and pain. So back to the marriage example, okay, you don't lose a partner through divorce, but you can lose a partner through death, and that still brings on much grievance and so forth. So basically, where there is attachment, there is suffering. Now, the three poisons are taught mainly with respects to the realm of desire. And the three poisons reflect the strong defilements of the beings in the desire realm, and particularly human beings. However, it doesn't fully capture the qualities in terms of defilement, not qualities, it doesn't fully capture all sentient beings in the Buddhist cosmos in terms of the defilements that keep us all in the cycle of life and death and within these six realms. Because remember, the form and the formless realms do not manifest hatred. So of the three poisons, they're kind of missing one. And that is why sometimes when you read about defilements, there will also be the 4 categories of defilements. So the 3 poisons, the 3 roots are what is known as the 3 categories of defilements. And that relates particularly to humans and sentient beings in the desire realm. The 4 categories of defilements capture all beings, including the sentient beings in the form and the formless realms. So these defilements are categorized as views, desire, arrogance, and ignorance. So there are many approaches to explain these 4 categories, and in Venerable Yin-Shun's teachings, he points out 3. So these are the 3 that we will go through today. So the first is the classification in terms of the 4 subtle roots. The next is the understanding of these 4 defilements in terms of theory, practice, and subtle and coarse defilements. And the third is where ignorance is taken to be the source of all defilements. And we'll go through those one by one. So in the explanation of the 4 subtle roots, these 4 defilements are referring to the very, very, very subtle forms of defilement. And so these forms are very subtle. They do not manifest strong unwholesomeness, but they are still regarded as defilements because they are strong enough to create the karma that keeps us stuck in this cycle of life and death. So in the consciousness only school, these 4 defilements are found in the 7th consciousness. So for those who are not aware of this, the consciousness only school puts forward that there are 8 levels of consciousness. So the first to the 6 are what most of us would know, which relates to the 5 sense organs, and then the 6 is the consciousness of the 6th sense, the mind. The 7th goes even deeper, and then you have the 8th, which is also known as the alaya. So in the consciousness only school, these 4 defilements are so subtle that they can only be detected in the 7th consciousness. So that means our usual activity consciousness cannot really detect these 4. And the only way to detect them is to get into deep meditation and then use that level of meditation to start to observe and carry out insight meditation. So with these very subtle defilements, they are considered the inner core defilements of all sentient beings. And so sometimes they are also, the word self is added to it. And therefore you have self-ignorance, self-view, self-arrogance, and self-desire. So self-ignorance, under this scheme of explanation, the view of ignorance relates to the intrinsic or innate belief that I exist. And then because we have this attachment to this view of I, that's what we call the self view. Now, due to having this view of an I, we develop arrogance. But remember, this is a very subtle form of arrogance. And with the view of an I that exists, we also develop craving or this desire towards oneself. So if you want to gain liberation, we have to overcome these very subtle forms of defilements. And so that's one way to explain why the beings in the form and the formless realms, even though they don't have the coarse defilements that we see in the desire realm, they still have these really subtle defilements, and so they are still caught in the cycle of life and death. Now, the next theory, which explains these 4 defilements, can be found in the Agama teachings, and it basically splits it into theory and practice, and subtle and coarse. So defilements can be split into errors due to theory and practice. And when we talk about theory, it's in terms of errors in views, errors in our understanding and comprehension and perceptions and so forth. This can be corrected by proper teachings and explanations. So if we can have access, if we are able to access the Dharma teachings and good teachers that can help us correct our errors in views and understanding, this will help with this will help to overcome this particular aspect of defilement. However, these 4 defilements also have the practice aspect to it. And these are the errors from desire and our experiences. To correct this aspect of defilement, not only do we need to have first corrected our views, the theory part, we then need to apply diligent training, because there is a mismatch sometimes, and a clear example is overcoming an addiction. So for example, you might have a teenager who gets themselves hooked onto ice. The thing here is there's a lot of education out there that ice, the drug ice, is bad. However, for some reason it doesn't seem to sink in, and so they try it. And after they try it, if you know what that drug does, it almost creates the addiction quite quickly. And that addiction then turns out to be a physical and a mental desire and craving for it. But after a while, they do realize it's nothing but suffering, and they want to get out. So they start to correct their understanding, and they start to understand that this drug is bad. I want out. But just because they want out, it doesn't mean their addiction suddenly disappears. They still have the experiential aspect and the physiological reaction that makes them still feel they need to take the drug. And that, to overcome that, is really training to get themselves to really let go and overcome those cravings for it. So this goes back to a bit of what I was trying to explain yesterday, Anne-Marie, to your question. When we know something, it doesn't mean we automatically are skilled at that particular thing. So when we learn about emptiness, and we can even tell other people what emptiness means in Buddhism, it does not equate to the fact that have we realized it? Have we truly realized it? So the common saying is that learning or knowing is not hard, but doing is. So this is the split between theory and practice in terms of these defilements. Knowing that they are defilements is one thing, but actually being able to overcome them is the practice, relies on the practice aspects. And then these 4 defilements are also split into what is subtle and what is coarse. So the coarse aspects of theory particularly relates to views, and the subtle aspects of theory is our ignorance. In terms of practice, the coarse defilement is desires, and the subtle practice of the aspect is the arrogance. So the overcoming the coarse aspects is considered much more easier, but it's the subtle aspects that we really need to try and overcome. And in particular, under this theory and teaching, we need to overcome arrogance in order to fully gain liberation. However, under this theory, we can still have subtle ignorance. And the way this type of subtle ignorance is explained is they're a bit like residual habits, the residual, the remnants of our habits, but they are not extreme enough to still keep us in the cycle of life and death. And an example is often given to compare the arahats and the Buddha's wisdom. So there are gaps in the arahat's wisdom, but that does not stop them from being an arahat. So one example, and you may have heard this story before, is there was once a man who came to the monastery, the Jetavana monastery, and he sought renunciation. He wanted to practice like all of Buddha's disciples. And so the arahats went into meditation and started to go back and sort of like doing a spiritual fact-checking to see, does he have the cause? Has he planted the seed for renunciation and the ultimate attainment of arahatship? And so they checked and checked and they couldn't find any seeds, so they rejected his request. And being rejected by the great arahats, he was really sad, and he was sitting outside the monastery's gates crying, and the Buddha happened to come by and asked him what's wrong. And so he told the Buddha, oh, I want to renounce, I want to practice and gain arahathood as well. But the arahats told me I don't have the cause, and so they won't let me renounce. And so the Buddha kindly said, that's okay, I will take you in. So I guess, you know, if the Buddha says it's okay, then it must be okay. And not long after, under the Buddha's guidance and teachings, that person actually did become an arahat. And so it really shocked all the other disciples, because they had done, well, they thought they had done their work and checked, and they couldn't see the seed, but the Buddha could. And so the Buddha explained to them after the arahats inquired, he said that the arahats only researched back to a certain number of lives, whereas the Buddha went way, way further back and was able to see that in one extremely, extremely distant life ago, while that person was hunting in the forest, he was chased by a tiger. And in the course of being chased, out of, you know, just looking for something to grapple on, he actually called out, "Oh, Buddha." And that one small glimmer of faith in the Buddha to call out to the Buddha for help planted the seed that allowed him to now, under the Buddha's guidance, attain arahathood. So this is one example of the difference in the wisdom of the Buddha and the wisdom of the arahats. And so this type of subtle ignorance, little gaps in knowledge, is not defiling in the sense that it will keep the arahats from attaining liberation. But arrogance is that clinging to the self, the very subtle and deep and inner, you don't see it until you really, really look inside. And so as long as you have that clinging to a self, you can't gain liberation. So under this particular explanation of the 4 types of defilements, arrogance has to be overcome if you want to gain liberation. Now, the third explanation of these 4 defilements puts ignorance smack bang as the source defilement for everything. And then in terms of views, desires, and arrogance, they are the further splits of ignorance. And so ignorance gives rise to views, ignorance gives rise to desires, ignorance gives rise to arrogance. And views relates to defilements that concern our understanding. Desires relate to defilements concerning our emotions. And arrogance, in this sense, are defilements that relate to our volition and our intentions and so forth. So basically, under this explanation, ignorance is the key thing. So we have to overcome ignorance if we want liberation. So in this discussion on defilement, I've cut out some things and I've just tried to give you the main things. But what we need to understand and take away, because I know most people will forget a lot of this material, but hopefully what you will remember is defilements are needed to create new karmic forces, and they nourish the existing ones to ripen as well. So defilement brings forth cyclic existence. Some people say, with your karmic forces, it brings forth cyclic existence. But remember, without defilements to become the catalyst for those karmic forces to become active, that's why some people actually say that it's more accurate to say defilement brings forth cyclic existence. So which defilement then is the most fundamental? And depending on the teachings you're looking at and you read, some will point to ignorance as being the fundamental defilement. Some will point to desire and craving as the fundamental defilement. Some will just point out specifically it's the attachment to I that is the fundamental defilement. And a good way to understand and try to discern what is the most fundamental, we're given the simile of a person who is blindfolded and then tangled up in vines. So the blindfold is the desire of ignorance. It doesn't allow us to see things clearly. And all the vines that cling onto us and causes us to be bound and tied up, they are like the defilement of desire that just keeps pulling us in all different directions. And the more we try to move away, the more it also pulls us as well. So under this simile, we should be able to understand we need to remove the blindfold first, and then we can slowly take and remove ourselves from the vines. So removing the blindfold is to tackle ignorance. But once we learn about the Dharma, once we learn about the teachings and we're tackling ignorance, we also have to practice in order to remove the vines. So the most fundamental desire is ignorance. And the only way to overcome that is through wisdom. And wisdom here, remember, is wisdom in the Buddhist sense. So this draws my my talks for this year to an end. And but after looking at karma, looking at the 3 life cycles and defilements and all that, we still need to ask, what does it all mean for our practice? So the hard yards have been done. Now the final bit is to just start to reflect on what does it mean for our practice. So our cycle, the cycle of suffering and all that is succinctly represented in ignorance, which then drives karma, our actions and so forth. And then because of our karma, there is suffering. So if we follow this path and reverse it and go backwards, if you don't want to experience suffering, then you start looking at, how do I tackle my karma? And that means we need to start to be more mindful of the karma we choose to create. So what do we do, what we say, what we think? We need to be a bit more mindful of that. And not only do we practice to ensure we carry out wholesome karma and stop unwholesome karma, we then should look further and say, if your aim is liberation, then karma, working on karma is not enough, because you need to go further to start tackling the defilements and ultimately to remove them if you want liberation. So when we talk about liberation, we're talking about cessation. And here cessation means the ending of suffering. And it can also, cessation also has the positive meaning of peace and stillness. And that's the peace and the stillness of nirvana. So liberation, when we want to end suffering, there are 2 aspects. There is the ultimate cessation of cyclic existence, which is what most people tend to think about when they hear the word liberation. But remember, there should also be the temporary cessation of suffering in this life. So what that means is we can still help ourselves and other people to gain liberation from what they're experiencing now, even though it's temporary. When we see people that are in suffering, we should help them so that they can reduce their suffering or whatever predicament they're in. Once it's manageable, once the pain and the suffering is at a level that they can handle and manage, then it's actually a lot easier to be able to control our actions and our practice. So not only does that work for helping others, it also works for helping ourselves. So, when you're sick, go and see a doctor. When you're sleepy and it's, really becoming so bad, you feel that you can't continue with your practice of meditation, then go to sleep. Get some rest and then come back and do your meditation. So there's the temporary cessation of suffering. And sometimes this is important to remember in our daily practice. So the ending of defilements is something that we should all, seriously, as a serious Buddhist practitioner, we should all be targeting that this aspect. And that means we're not, mass murderers or really evil criminals, but what are the things we can do in our daily lives to improve ourselves? What type of defilements do I have that I really should start to pay attention to and start to do something about it? So perhaps we should start looking at, are we generally a lazy person? How can I overcome that laziness? Or do we tend to have envy and anger arise quite easily? you know. So maybe we need to start looking at tackling that. Or selfishness. You know, some people are very generous to their family, but they're very selfish towards everyone outside of their so-called family circle. And vice versa. Some people are very generous to strangers, but absolutely stingy towards their own family. You know, things like these are the defilements that we come across in our daily lives. We should start to reflect on that. You know, do we tend to take our anger out on our family, on our partner, on our children, and so forth? Should we learn to control that? And definitely, I would say that for a lot of us, anger is something that, you know, is quite a common defilement that we really should put effort into tackling. And then in terms of the root defilements, okay, so what we're talking about just then is the temporary aspect, to look at how we can make things better on a daily basis. But we also need to have the ultimate aspect, the ultimate goal, sorry, to tackle ignorance and to tackle our desires. So it's like, you know, when you're cutting down a tree, if the tree is really big, sometimes you do need to trim off the larger branches first. But until you actually cut it from the stump, that tree is still alive. So you may tackle your defilements here and there, but if you don't tackle the root defilements, all the other defilements can start to come back. So back to the tree simile, you know, you're trimming off all the large branches so that it makes it more manageable to fall the tree. But if for some reason you then don't go through with felling the tree completely, it'll grow back because the root defilements are still there. So tackling our ignorance, how do we go about tackling our ignorance? And that is, we need to develop our wisdom, and particularly developing our understanding of emptiness, dependent co-arising, selflessness. So what this means is we need to progress in our learning of the Dharma. And the usual path of progression is to learn and then to contemplate on what we have learned and then to actually put it into practice. And when you start putting it into practice, it helps to improve your learning and your contemplation as well. Now, the element of practice actually encompasses the bottom section, which is the practices of morality, the practices of meditative concentration, and wisdom. And here, the arrows are indicating that the prior aspect is supportive of the subsequent. So you need to develop your morality to a certain extent before your meditative concentration can truly start to take flight. If your moral practices are not solid, it'll be very hard for you to actually develop the wholesome type of meditative concentration that is required to then further become the supports and the foundations for the development of wisdom. Now, in terms of tackling desires, first thing is we need to develop our wisdom so that once we have the right views and right understanding, we can start to address our desires through our practice and through the training we undertake in our daily lives. So remember, wisdom is the guide. Wisdom, once we develop it properly and understand it and understand the Dharma teachings well, this wisdom will develop and it becomes our guide. It motivates us towards wholesomeness, and it just makes us not want to engage in unwholesomeness as well, because we know it's bad. We know to steer clear from that. Now, to eliminate our inner defilements, that's when we gain liberation. And liberation provides us with a calming sensation, a joyfulness, a stillness Now, this stillness and calm, sometimes people just hear of everything is still. They might think it's a bit cold, a bit aloof, but this stillness of liberation in nirvana, there's a joy to it. And the simile that we are given is it's like escaping from a burning house. You know, if you're caught in a fire, and I know that quite well, if you're caught in a fire, your mind is actually very, you feel very lightheaded because you're hoping someone just comes and pulls you out of there. But then you know that there's no one else and you have to get yourself out. So you start to have anxiety, you start to, you know, all silly thoughts starts to pop up in your head. Can I do this? Can I do that? And even the thought of maybe I should just hide in a corner or hide under the Buddha statue and stuff like that. So, but once you actually get yourself out and you know you're safe, it's like the burden and the anxiety, the stress and all that, it leaves you mentally, it leaves you physically, and your mind is clear, your body is relaxed, and you just have a sense of really calm. But that calm is also very blissful. So when people talk about stillness, don't misunderstand that it means cold and no joy. So the joy of nirvana, this joy that you feel, it's not like the excitement that you get from happiness. It's not like going to a rave party, that type of happiness. It's the feeling of being free from the burden of all constraints. And these constraints are the constraints arising from our defilements and keeping us shackled to cyclic existence. So what this means is we need to practice. You know, our karma are our actions, and through practice is the only way we can really gain liberation. And the different types of practices there are many practices, but the most common you will hear about are the Noble Eightfold Path and the 6 paramitas, or the 6 perfections. And of course, Venerable Tansa's talk about repentance, that's also a practice we can do. So this is a table just to try and make things a bit more concrete to help you. You know, we talk about practicing the 6 paramitas or the Noble Eightfold Path, but what does it actually mean? So the practice of generosity can include things like, you know, practicing giving, kind acts, kind speech and all that. And what this does is this helps to counteract our desire, selfishness, stinginess and so forth. Upholding the precepts, carrying out compassionate deeds, and so forth. Facing other people's poor behavior with calm, with empathy, is part of the practice of morality and tolerance, being patient with others and oneself. So these can help us to the morality aspect, you know, protects us against committing harmful deeds, and it nurtures purity. And the tolerance aspects actually helps us with counteracting anger and hatred, and it nurtures the virtues of forgiveness and kindness and so forth. So when people tell you, oh, practice the 6 paramitas, you can try and set up a table like this and start to think about what practices you can actually do, because this is, the names of the 6 paramitas are like an umbrella term to cover many practices. So as you read the Dharma teachings more and more, then what you can do is you can draw up these tables and start to see, well, which practice can actually slot into here. And even though this is to help you understand which practices go where, do not think that they are mutually exclusive. Okay, as you practice further and further, you will start to understand and see that practices of kindness, giving, also can entail and have elements of the practices of morality, the practices of tolerance, diligence, meditation, and so forth. Okay, so this is a good way for you guys to help to start synthesizing the information you get from all the different sources and all the different Dharma teachings that you hear. So there are many practices in the Buddhist scriptures, and the different schools have different thoughts and so forth about it. So each will cater to a different audience. So what suits you may not suit another person. And if you find what is suitable for you, then that's great, and just go for it. But when you listen to the Dharma teachings and you hear all these different practices, one important thing is to not think about which one's right and which one's wrong. It's rather you should be thinking about who is this suitable for, and if you want, you keep it in your you keep it as your arsenal of weapons to help people overcome their defilements. So if you know that this particular practice doesn't suit me, but it could suit a person of this particular foundation, spiritual capacity, then if you do meet with that person, then you can share that teaching with them. So I hope that when we learn about this, when we learn about these teachings, you know, don't always start to think, well, who's right and who's wrong. We should be thinking about who were they trying to teach and learn from that. So repentance is an important practice, as you should know by now from Venerable Tansa's talk. So that finally draws my lesson to its end, and hopefully this will be able to help give you some direction in terms of your practice and when you come across other teachings as well. So we've gone over time a bit. Do you still want to do the final metta meditation? Or do you have other things to do? Okay. All right. So we'll do the final metta.
Yeah.
Sorry, what was that?
We do the metta.
Okay. All right. So get yourself comfortable. Prepare yourself to shine a light on the world. Shine a light on the people you care about. Okay, so take a few deep breaths. Relax your tensions. Give yourself a bit of a stretch if you need. And start to take a few deep breaths. Let all the worries of the day, all the angst, all the things that are unpleasant that you've come across in your day, just let it all out. No use keeping it with you. Breathe it all out and just breathe in the purity of a new start. And when you're ready, you start to bring your focus and your attention to yourself. You start to let the light of kindness grow in your heart. Let that light develop in strength. Let it glow. Let it fill your body with warmth, with serenity, with comfort. And then treat yourself well. Take care of yourself. May I be safe, well, and happy. May I truly be safe, well, and happy. Now let that light inside of you, that metta, that compassion, let that light shine forth unreservedly and shine it on our parents, our mothers and our fathers. They have cared for us. They have given us life. They have nurtured us. May they truly be safe, well, and happy. Let that light fill them with kindness. And then let your light of compassion grow even more, stronger and brighter. And send that out to my teachers, to my spiritual guides, who have compassionately and patiently shown me the way. I genuinely wish that they are safe, well, and happy. Shine your light out even further. Let it know no bounds. Share it with your family, your partners, your brothers and sisters and close friends, those who have been there for you, supported you, those who have given us companionship and friendship. I sincerely wish that they are all safe, well, and happy. Send that loving kindness, send that metta out even further to my work colleagues, to my neighbors, the people in my community. Although we may not always get along, but they are my community, and I truly wish that they can all be safe, well, and happy.
Hello?
Now, let that light of kindness really, really develop in strength. Let it just shine from you and let it reach even your enemies, those who have given me much distress and sadness and even hurt. May I learn to let go of that resentment, and may I be able to restore a harmonious relationship. I do wish them, I really do wish that they too can be safe, well, and happy. And now to all beings, whether we know them or we don't, whether we see them or we don't, to all sentient beings to whom we are closely connected, may all beings find shelter, protection, and comfort in these difficult times. May all beings be free from hatred, desire, and any danger. May we all be free from mental suffering. May we all be free from physical suffering. May we all truly be safe, well, and happy. Just let that kindness flow naturally from you. And whoever it touches, share that kindness with them. May all beings really be able to find shelter and protection. And may they all be free from hatred, desires, and any danger. May my enemies too be free from hatred, desires, and danger. May they truly be safe, well, and happy. May my work colleagues, my neighbors, the people in my community, may we all be free from danger. May we all truly be safe, well, and happy. May my family, my partners, brothers and sisters, and all my friends, may they all be free from danger. And may they all be safe, well, and happy. May my teachers and spiritual guides, may they too be free from danger. May they also be safe, well, and happy. And my parents, my wonderful parents, may they truly be safe, well, and happy. And slowly bring the attention and focus back to yourself. Feel that light of compassion inside of you. May I be free from danger, and may I truly be safe, well, and happy. Let that light fill you with happiness, and slowly bring your meditation to a close. Keep that happiness, keep that kindness inside of you. And when you are ready, take a few deep breaths and then slowly open your eyes.
So I just put a link up in chat for the donation so you can practice generosity and dana, one of the paramitas. So
Thank you, everybody. Hope to see you
Thank you,
all.
everyone.
Be
Thank
happy.
you, Faye, and thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much for organizing this wonderful Zoom retreat.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Venerable YanRong.